Treason is not the reason for the season. Episode 23, Tale of Two Democracies. Or, it's the racism, stupid. The main internal battle after the Revolutionary War was the fight between slave states and abolitionists. This manifested in the Constitutional Convention. The word slave is never used in the Constitution, but slavery shows up in three indirect references in the Constitution: the Three-Fifths Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Clause, and the prohibition on outlawing the importation of slaves for 20 years. The fight between slavery and abolitionist movement affected the design of the federal government itself. The number of senators was fixed at 2 per state. The number of representatives in the House was to be proportional to the population in each state. The problem was that about a third of the population in the South were slaves who were denied the right to vote. The North didn't want to count those slaves to give the South more votes in the House, especially if those slaves had no right to vote for those representatives. The South wanted to count all the slaves to pack the number of representatives in their favor. The result was the notorious Three-Fifths Compromise. This allowed the South to inflate their power in the House over the North. But the method for electing the president also ended up being impacted by the fight between slavery and abolitionists. The Constitutional Convention first suggested a direct democratic vote by the people to elect the president. This was quickly shot down. The math for the South was simple: the North and South had roughly equal population, but again, a third of the population in the South were slaves, who would not be able to vote for president. If the president was directly voted for by the people, Northern voters outnumbered Southern voters 4-3. Instead of direct voting, the Electoral College system was proposed. The Electoral College gave each state electoral votes based on the number of representatives in the House plus 2 for the Senate. And that number of representatives included 3/5 of slaves. Furthermore, in 1789, slave states outnumbered free states 8-5, therefore the plus 2 electoral votes per state gave slave states 16 EC votes compared to the North's extra 10 EC votes. I.e., the Electoral College plus 2 per state gave the South another 6-vote advantage over the North. The result of the Electoral College was that, in 1790, a voter in the South had 1.4 times the presidential voting power of a voter in the North. This power can be seen in who became president. From Washington's first day as president in 1789 until the first day of Lincoln's term in office in 1861, there were 71 years' worth of presidents in the White House. During that period, the only abolitionists in the White House were John Adams and John Quincy Adams. Martin Van Buren was an abolitionist later in life, but he campaigned for president on opposing abolition and maintaining slavery in existing states. In the first 70 years, abolitionists were in the White House for a total of 8 years. And one reason for this was that the Electoral College gave the South outsized influence. The only reason Lincoln was elected president was because by 1860, the North outnumbered the South almost 4-1, with 20 million in the North and 6 million in the South plus 3 million slaves. In 1858, for the first time in America's history, the number of free states outnumbered the number of slave states by 17-15. At which point, the Electoral College that had favored the South was no longer enough for the South to control who became president. 3 days after Lincoln's election, South Carolina declared Lincoln's election, the result of a fair and legal democratic process, to be a hostile act and seceded from the Union. Before Lincoln was inaugurated into office on March of 1861, 7 slave states had already left the Union. 5 weeks after Lincoln was inaugurated, the South committed treason by taking up arms against the United States, bombarding Fort Sumter in an unprovoked attack, starting the Civil War. The South went along with democracy as long as democracy did exactly and only what they wanted. And when the South found themselves outnumbered in votes, losing control of the presidency, they committed treason and went to war against their own countrymen. Apparently America had so much fun with this, they decided to run the same playbook a second time. After the Civil War, once Reconstruction ended, the South was allowed to implement Jim Crow laws. Once the South was able to establish segregation under the guise of separate but equal, once the South was able to establish a two-tier system of justice that subjugated blacks politically, and the KKK subjugated blacks via terrorism, once the South got things back to the way they wanted them, racists were fine with American democracy again. White supremacists went along with democracy for nearly a century. The civil rights movement of the 1960s took much of that away. Separate but equal and segregation were no longer allowed. Disenfranchisement of black voters was no longer allowed. Suddenly, white racists weren't able to maintain their two-tiered justice system where they were the preferred citizen. As a result, racists got violent. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. And just 3 years later, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. In California, Black Panthers are openly carrying firearms in the 1960s. Republican Governor Ronald Reagan signs the Mulford Act of 1967, which enacted some strict gun control laws, and prohibited open carry. It was meant to disarm the Black Panthers. The NRA supports passage of the law. In 1968, the Gun Control Act was passed, partly in response to JFK and Martin Luther King Jr. being assassinated. It adds many restrictions to gun laws, prohibiting felons and others from owning guns, prohibiting mail-order guns, which is how JFK's assassin got his rifle. The Gun Control Act of 1968 was supported by the National Rifle Association. Both the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were signed by Democrat President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1964. In 1968, Republican Richard Nixon developed the Southern Strategy, campaigning for president on promises that he opposed school busing, on promises to appoint strict constructionists to the Supreme Court. Strict constructionism is a particular legal philosophy of judicial interpretation that limits or restricts such interpretation only to the exact wording of the law. This would mean they would support separate but equal because the 14th Amendment only required equal protection, but said nothing to prevent them from being separate. In other words, strict constructionists are just another flavor of the inanity that is cherry-picking textualism. Which is to say, Nixon became president by catering to panicky white racists. Nixon started the war on drugs. Nixon's lawyer, John Ehrlichman, admitted in 1994 that the purpose of Nixon's war on drugs was to create laws that allowed police to target anti-war protesters and blacks. This war on drugs was an attempt to legitimize the criminalization of people for being black in the eyes of police and the justice system. The Posse Comitatus organization was founded in the U.S. in the 1960s. It was a far-right, conspiracy theory-laden, anti-government, white supremacist group. They were survivalists, refused to pay taxes, rejected fiat money not backed by gold. Posse Comitatus members have killed federal employees and police officers. And they played a role in forming armed citizen militia movements in the 1990s. In 1976, the book The Turner Diaries was published. It tells the story of white supremacists overthrowing the federal government, sparking a race war which ends with the white supremacists exterminating all Jews, non-whites, liberals, and politicians. In 1986, the NRA does a 180 course change. Up until this point, the NRA had a history of supporting reasonable gun control laws. It supported the National Firearms Act of 1934, which heavily regulated bearable but terrible weapons such as machine guns, explosives, suppressors, and large-caliber weapons. It supported the Mulford Act of 1968, which regulated guns in California. But by the mid-80s, it pushed FOPA, which would undo many of the restrictions of the Gun Control Act of 1968. In 1995, white supremacist Timothy McVeigh blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people. It still is one of the worst domestic terror attacks in U.S. history. He was found with pages of the Turner Diaries after his attack. In 2002, FBI Assistant Director Dale Watson testified before the Senate, saying that since the 1990s, right-wing extremism had become the most dangerous domestic terrorist threat to the country. He also testified that domestic right-wing terrorist groups often adhere to the principles of racial supremacy. In 2005, Florida adopted its Stand Your Ground law, which statistically speaking, is used to defend whites shooting blacks twice as often as it defends blacks shooting whites. Many other states have adopted similar Stand Your Ground laws, and have seen homicides go up as a result, but that isn't what matters. What matters is Stand Your Ground laws allow whites to shoot blacks. When Florida passed its Stand Your Ground law, self-defense claims tripled. The Black Lives Matter movement was founded in response to George Zimmerman being acquitted in the 2012 shooting death of black teen Trayvon Martin using the Stand Your Ground law as his get-out-of-jail-free card. In 2015, white supremacist Dylan Roof committed mass murder, killing 9 black people in a church. When white police officers caught up with him on the road, they arrested him without firing a single shot, and later got him food from Burger King. By contrast, John Crawford was a black man buying a legal BB gun at a Walmart store in Ohio. Police shot and killed him within seconds of showing up. One might argue, but he had a BB gun and they confused it for a real gun, except Ohio is an open carry state, so even if it was a real gun, openly carrying a gun in a Walmart store shouldn't be an automatic shoot-to-kill response from police. Per capita, blacks are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than whites. In response to Dylan Roof's mass murder, many cities started looking at removing statues of Confederate traitors from their pedestals. White supremacists were the strongest opposition to this movement. In 2017, hundreds of white nationalists showed up at the Unite the Right rally to defend Confederate statues, in Charlottesville, Virginia, with polo shirts, tiki torches, gas masks, and weapons. One of them drove a car into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing 1 and injuring 35. All to defend statues of Confederate traitors who went to war against their own countrymen to enslave an entire people. In 2021, FBI Director Christopher A. Wray testified before the Senate saying that domestic right-wing terrorism incidents had doubled in a year, that the number of investigations into white supremacists has tripled, and that domestic terrorism has been metastasizing around the country for a long time now. Here's the short version. 1964, LBJ passed the Civil Rights Act. 1967, NRA supports gun control law, Mulford Act of 1967 which disarms Black Panthers. 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. 1968, Republicans adopted the Southern strategy to appeal to white supremacists. 1969, the white supremacist Posse Comitatus organization was founded. 1971, war on drugs was created by Nixon, to criminalize being black. 1978, the Turner Diaries, white supremacists overthrow government, commit genocide. 1979, they can take my gun when they pry it from my cold dead fingers bumper sticker. 1986, NRA flips and now supports deregulation of guns. Supports FOPA 1986. 1990s, militia as terrorism extremist groups rapidly expanded in the 90s. 1995, Timothy McVeigh, white supremacist, blew up federal building. 2005, Stand Your Ground law passed in Florida. The police are more than 3 times more likely to kill a black person than white. 2008, Heller ruling moves to arm militia as terrorism extremists. 2015, Dylan Roof commits mass murder of blacks. Police get him Burger King. 2017, Unite the Right defends statues of traitors with vehicular homicide. If you don't see the pattern, allow me to spell it out for you, it's the racism, stupid. If you still don't see the pattern, it's because you refuse to see it. Not until after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did shall not be infringed start getting interpreted as an absolute on a large scale. And the thing that has been driving this nonsense is white racists who want to anonymously hoard unregistered guns to overthrow the government and commit terrorism against blacks. From 1790, the U.S. operated under principles of law that the right to bear arms in the Second Amendment was tied to militia service. There was no right to public carry, and there were laws against storing a loaded gun, because the right to bear arms was for forming militias in times of war, and in times of peace, militia members didn't need to go around packing heat. The law generally held to the principle of a duty to retreat, of not using deadly force if you could protect yourself through non-lethal means. But from the Civil Rights Act being passed, white racists militarized themselves, radicalized themselves, and marched towards committing terrorism and treason. They are the loudest voice behind the shift to interpret shall not be infringed in an absolute sense. Because they want anonymous, unregistered guns with no background checks so they can arm themselves to commit treason and terrorism. And the Republican Supreme Court obliged the white racist domestic terrorists in the 2008 Heller case, attempting to completely disconnect the right to bear arms from the militia service. Attempting to deregulate all access to guns. From the President Washington until Lincoln, white racists went along with democracy. Days after Lincoln won the election, white racists declared the result of a fair and free election to be a hostile act. Weeks after Lincoln was sworn in, white racists committed treason attacking Fort Sumter and started the Civil War. Then for nearly a century of Jim Crow, white racists went along with democracy again. But ever since the Civil Rights Act passed, they have been on the warpath committing terrorism against blacks and committing treason against the nation. They defend racist cops killing unarmed blacks. They defend statues of racists traitors up on pedestals. They blow up federal buildings, they plow cars into crowds, they commit murder. The French Revolution devolved into mob violence and civil war and imploded within 20 years. The US is flirting with exactly the same playbook, twice, just on a much slower time scale. White racists commit mob violence, terrorism, and treason. Their launching of the Civil War nearly tore the nation apart. And since the Civil Rights Act, they've been trying to start a race war and take down the federal government. The French Revolution ended with Bonaparte as emperor. The United States saw a racist president attempt a coup and act as if he were a king. Trump's presidency was defined by racism, a Muslim ban, racism against blacks, calling Mexicans rapists, calling immigrants criminals, a boondoggle of a wall, saying that there are many fine Nazis on both sides, resorting to various racist attacks against China, telling the Proud Boys to stand by for further orders, and more. Just after Trump won the election, a conference of white supremacist yuppies gave a Nazi salute, shouting Heil Trump. The Proud Boys made t-shirts saying stand down and stand by, indicating they were awaiting further orders. And then on January 6, Trump told a mob that they needed to go down to the Capitol building and fight like hell to keep him president. In the crowd that stormed the Capitol building were members of more than a dozen extremist groups, including Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, Nationalist Socialist Club, and QAnon. Some of these people had also been at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, which saw a white supremacist ram a car into a crowd of people, murdering one, and injuring 35 people. The mob marched from Trump's speech to the Capitol building, erected a gallows pole, went through the Capitol building shouting "Hang Mike Pence." Some of the mob were photographed in tactical military gear, helmets, carrying zipped handcuffs, suggesting they intended at a minimum to hold people hostage or kidnap them and move them to another location. Capitol Police barricaded several doors, and rioters continued their attempts to break through the barricades. At one point, police shot and killed a woman who had broken through one of these barricades. 140 officers were injured by the mob. At least 650 people have been charged. A sweep of the area found 2 pipe bombs. One of the rioters, Lonnie Kaufman, pleaded guilty to illegally bringing 5 firearms and 11 Molotov cocktails to the Capitol. This is the white racist mob trying to commit treason, trying to overthrow the peaceful transfer of power, trying to subvert democracy. This is exactly why white racists push for an absolute interpretation of shall not be infringed, because they want these guns to overthrow the government. They want to get guns anonymously. They want to get guns with no registration to link the gun back to them. And Supreme Court judges, from a position of privileged cluelessness, have been happy to deregulate guns and arm terrorists and traitors. An urban legend says that if you put a frog in water and slowly bring it to a boil, the frog won't notice the water getting hot, won't jump out, and will be boiled alive. The story captures an important idea: if you do something slow enough, a lot of people don't notice. The French Revolution quickly devolved into mob violence and collapsed within 20 years. In the US, the first round of mob violence was the Civil War, which took 70 years from the Constitution's ratification. The second round of violence lay dormant for the century that was Jim Crow, but started metastasizing after the Voting Rights Act was passed in the 1960s. And it has been building, getting worse and worse for decades. Racists in government criminalized being black. Systemic police racism are 3 times more likely to kill a black person versus a white person. Stand your ground laws outsource the violence from the police to white civilians who use the law to shoot black people. Racists started forming militia as terrorism groups, and they started pushing for deregulation of gun laws so they wouldn't be hindered from arming themselves to commit treason and terrorism. In 2008, the Supreme Court obliged with their Heller ruling, doing their best to enable terrorist groups to arm themselves without any pesky gun regulations getting in the way. And since Heller, we see those militia as terrorism racists, armed and emboldened, committing mass murder, ramming cars into crowds of innocents, arming themselves to protect statues of traitors, storming the Capitol building with a gallows pole fully intending to hang the vice president. It took decades to get from strong gun control laws of the 1968 Gun Control Act, to the attempt at total gun deregulation of Heller in 2008. But the thing that sparked it was the end of Jim Crow, and the thing that has driven it are white supremacists trying to use terror and treason, guns and mob violence, to subvert democracy because it is no longer giving them what they want. Article 2, Section 8 of the Constitution states that Congress has the power to organize, arm, discipline, and govern the militia. Section 3 says the Army, Navy, and militia are subservient to the President. The Second Amendment ties the right to bear arms to militia service. The Militia Act of 1792 required militia members to register with the state for militia service, report to the state for regular training, subjected militia members to military discipline, mandated that militia members were subject to the same laws of war as the Army, and made militia members subject to court-martial, fines, and imprisonment for disobeying the orders of the President, their Commander-in-Chief. And the Militia Act of 1792 mandated that members possess a single musket and 24 rounds of ammunition. The rest of the ammo, if ever needed, would be supplied by the Army once the militia was activated. Militia members were not intended to be military superstores, with every weapon imaginable, millions of rounds FO ammunition, acting as a supply chain to the Army. The Militia Act of 1792 was passed a year after the Second Amendment was ratified. And it makes clear exactly what the founders meant when they spoke of the militia and the right to bear arms. White supremacists want none of this. They don't want registration because they want anonymity. Many of worst white supremacists could not pass a background check, and would be unable to possess a gun. Many want to stockpile weapons to start a race war, commit domestic terrorism, and commit treason taking up arms against the government. Background checks would get in their way of accomplishing this. Registration of weapons would locate clusters of white supremacists owning huge caches of weapons. The problem of white supremacy is not going away. It seems some see the problem, but think that maybe if we don't rock the boat, maybe the racists won't get violent. But the larger problem for white supremacists is only getting worse in their minds. The Civil Rights Act showed democracy turn against them, and racists have been organizing and growing ever since, hoping to turn the clocks back to the 1950s, hoping to make America great again. However, as of this writing, white people comprise about 60% of the U.S. population. Studies predict that whites in the U.S. will be less than 50% of the total population by 2045. White supremacists only go along with democracy as long as it gives them exactly what they want. As white supremacists lose their monopoly on the democratic process, as white supremacists become more and more of a minority, white supremacists are likely going to get more and more desperate and more violent. This ties directly to the Great Replacement conspiracy theory by white supremacists who see the loss of their majority position as some grand conspiracy by leftists or elites or shadowy lizard overlords to replace white people with people of color. During the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, white supremacists chanted, "Jews will not replace us." This replacement conspiracy theory has been used by violent extremists to justify murder. In 2019, El Paso, Texas, a white man with an assault rifle went into a Walmart, opened fire, and killed 23 people. The arrest warrant affidavit said the shooter confessed to detectives that he targeted Mexicans in his attack. Police tied the shooter to a manifesto that talked about a Hispanic invasion and said the Great Replacement was part of the inspiration for the attack. As white supremacists become more of a minority, as white supremacists lose control of democracy, white supremacists will become more violent towards people of color and more violent towards democracy. Those who think we can avoid this problem by doing nothing, those who hope white supremacists won't get violent if we leave them alone, are kidding themselves. The people shouting the loudest to deregulate guns are white supremacists who are willing to use violence to maintain power. The more their position becomes a minority, the louder they will shout, and the more violent they will become. They are not going to go away quietly. The purpose of these videos has been, first and foremost, to address the lax gun control laws that make it so easy for criminals to get guns that the U.S. firearm homicide rate makes the country look like a war zone, to explain that the founders were totally fine with gun control laws, that shall not be infringed was never meant to overrule the Constitution's clauses that give Congress the power to regulate, discipline, and govern militias, that the founders intended for all other gun laws not related to militia service to be handled at the state level. But the problem is, no matter how much you explain history and context and the Constitution and how it was created and what the founders intended, there will always be a very vocal group of people who oppose any and all gun regulations, white supremacists. And they will resort to all manner of shenanigans and nonsense to hide the fact that they just want deregulated guns to arm themselves for the race war they hope to start soon. So, they will try to quote "shall not be infringed" out of context and ignore everything else. They will try to quote the personal letter of one founder complaining about the Constitution as proving the real intent of the Constitution. They will fabricate quotes entirely. They will misrepresent crime data to downplay how bad things really are. They will portray any attempt at gun regulation as something only Hitler would do. In short, they will try every variation of the Chewbacca defense they can come up with. And the reason they do this, ultimately, is because they don't want to just straight up say, "I want completely deregulated gun laws so I can anonymously arm my private militia as terrorism group so we can commit terrorism against blacks and treason against the government." You cannot reason someone out of a position they were not reasoned into. And racism and bigotry isn't reason. It's hate. It's pure, raw, animalistic emotion. No amount of history, context, legal explanations, and facts will sway them. You must be prepared for this. And you need to understand that the biggest driver to deregulate guns is racism. The biggest opponent to gun regulation is racism. Racists are furious at the federal government for treating blacks as equals, and racists want guns to fight the government. Racists want guns to terrorize black people. This hate-driven push to deregulate guns has expanded to include other forms of bigotry. But they all have a common theme. Racists see all black people as more violent, more criminal, than whites. Homophobes see all gay people as potential child molesters. Transphobes see all transgender people as potential bathroom rapists. Islamophobes see all Muslims as potential terrorists. Bigots pretend a group is more criminal, more violent, than the average person, to justify their rage against the government for daring to treat people as equals, and to justify their terrorizing members of that group. Bigots want unregulated guns because they see the federal government attempting to treat people as equals as a special kind of tyranny. So bigots want unregulated guns to subvert democracy, to threaten the government, to overthrow the government. And bigots want unregulated guns so they can terrorize whatever group they have decided to hate, and do so without interference from the government trying to protect victims of bigotry. A regular person who likes to go hunting once in a while? They won't mind a little paperwork if you make it easy to deal with and you explain how it could cut gun homicides in half. A person who wants a long gun for home defense? They won't mind a little paperwork if you make it easy and you explain how it could cut gun homicides in half. So, you have to be clear exactly how the system will work, and exactly how it will reduce crime. And you have to be clear how this system would be completely in line with the intentions of the Founding Fathers. Because the racists don't care how they slow you down, as long as they slow you down. The Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate militias. The Constitution makes the Army, Navy, and militia subservient to the President. The Second Amendment ties the right to bear arms to militia service. The Militia Act of 1792 makes registration with the state mandatory for militia service, makes militia members subject to the same laws of war as the full-time army, and makes militia members subject to the same laws of court-martial for disobeying the President's orders. It also requires members have 1 musket and 24 rounds of ammunition, with the expectation that they will be resupplied by the full-time army. The Second Amendment mandates that states must allow whatever arms the federal government expects for militia service. And the Militia Act of 1792 defined the arms expected for militia service to be 1 musket, 24 shot, and a quarter pound of powder. All other arms and all other right to arms were left to the states to decide what to allow. The Founders never intended for the Constitution, the Second Amendment, or the Militia Act of 1792, to enable and encourage private, anonymous domestic terror groups to commit treason. If you want to see gun crime in America significantly reduced, if you want to see mass shootings reduced, if you want to see fewer domestic terrorism, then you need to turn the law back to the way the Founders originally designed it. And you need to understand how it got so perverted in the first place. Treason is not the reason for the Second Amendment. Treason is not the reason for the season. Good luck and Godspeed.